So back to historical Jesus. Last time we talked about the kind of three quests. The first quest, so christened by Schweitzer, he traces it from Reimarus up through Wrede. And what is the paradox that Schweitzer comes up with?
That Jesus is an anti-Semitic.
Well, that comes later. But what's the problem that Schweitzer notes with all the people who've come before? Authenticity. And what is it about, how do you know if you're in touch with the authentic Jesus? Because that's what we're trying to get at, right?
It's based off what you believe.
Yeah. The problem is you find whatever you go looking for. Right? He says those who were skeptics found a criminal or a thief. Those who were believers found, the Son of God. It's not exactly his language, but basically, you find what you're looking for. And he says that's a problem. As for one example, most of the scholars around the turn of the 20th century didn't like eschatology, right? And all this end of the world stuff with fire and brimstone, that's all kind of, out there. So we're rational minds. We don't like that stuff. Therefore, Jesus didn't say that, right? Because Jesus is obviously going to, be as rational and understanding as we are. And Schweitzer says you can't do that. You can't do that. He says they went looking for Jesus and they found a mirror. Right? And he says that's a problem. This creates a paradox, though. Because what then is the true sign of authenticity?
Did you see Jesus in context?
Well, that's what he says you have to do. And he says Jesus probably did say all this eschatological stuff because Jews at that time were very eschatological. But what's the paradox that this creates? You're in touch with, you're in touch with something authentic, the authentic Jesus, if what? If it's completely irrelevant to you. Right? Because then you're not kind of cooking the books and shaping things to make it turn out the way you want it to be. And Schweitzer came up with a Jesus that was pretty irrelevant to his faith. Right? He was an eschatological prophet who was wrong twice. Right? In Matthew 10, he sends out all the disciples thinking, the end is going to come before they get back, but then they all come back, so he has to go have a rethink. And he thinks, you know what? I got to go force God's hand. And so he goes up to Jerusalem to kind of force God's hand, except God doesn't move, and he gets put to death, and God doesn't vindicate him, and oh well. What this means is that many Christian scholars kind of leave historical Jesus stuff to the side for a while and focus instead on the Christ of faith, the Christ that we meet in our worship, in our prayers, because that's obviously relevant. And why do you want to spend time investigating something that's going to be irrelevant? Right? Some people feel that way about Greek. Why do I have to learn Greek? It's not irrelevant, though. But so with Schweitzer, the first quest kind of comes to an end. And you get kind of a pause in terms of major scholarly works. Now, you still have some people that are writing, novels of Jesus and all of that. But in terms of major scholarly work, you don't see it going on for a bit. What's the problem that creates? And this goes back to the point Angela raised earlier. Yeah, if you don't have anything tying the Christ of faith to the historical God, you become free to shape the Christ of faith however you want. And it becomes even more of a mirror. Right? And the ultimate evidence for this is Nazi Germany, where Jesus gets held up as the ultimate anti-Semite. And Ernst Käsemann, who was German and who was a student of Rudolf Bultmann, Bultmann, who says that the resurrection was basically Christ being resurrected in the hearts of his disciples. Had nothing to do with a physical body. It was just, they carried his memory forward, and we do the same. Casemont says, we got to call a big timeout because we've gone horribly wrong somewhere if we can end up having Jesus endorsing the Holocaust, right? And so he says we've got to come up with ways of kind of grounding our understanding of Jesus in history, in the bedrock of history. But you still have Schweitzer's paradox. Because if you find something useful, you probably just shaped it that way. So what is Casemont's solution? How can we get around Schweitzer's paradox? Yeah, he develops criteria. And criteria, the purpose behind them is to provide some objectivity. Okay, so you can say, well, it wasn't that I just wanted it to be this way, but here are the reasons why I think this is historical. Okay? Now, as you noted, if you read through the whole module on criteria, they're not really as objective as you might think, which is why you still have as many pictures of Jesus as there are scholars writing about it. When this first started, there was a hope that kind of all of this would coalesce and we would end up with a agreed upon unified picture of Jesus.
Not the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus?
Well, that one, pretty much, yeah. Hasn't happened. But how do these criteria work? And people use a lot of different criteria. I think we go through 6 of the most common. Multiple attestation. What's the idea here?
Multiple primary eyewitnesses in each gospel.
2 sources.
Right, and they have to be what? Independent. That's really important. Right, because if Garrett sees something and then he tells Mark and he tells Mary and she tells Angela, and then you all 4 come tell me individually, how many sources do I have for this event? Just 1. Right? But if you all see it individually and then you come and give me reports and they agree in certain things, well, then there's a high likelihood that we're in touch with something real. Okay? This is important then for the synoptic problem, and why some scholars are very reluctant to release Q. Because Q gives you another independent early source.
That is...
Now Q makes sense.
Right? Because then you can say, it's in Mark and it's in Q. Therefore, it's multiply attested and. Whereas if you subscribe to, say, Farrer-Golder, which is that Mark came first and Matthew used Mark and Luke used Matthew and Mark, how many sources do you have in the synoptics? Just 1. Yeah, Mark. At least everything coming from Mark. Now, stuff that they're bringing in, and then if John knows the synoptics, you don't even get John as an individual independent witness. Right? So a lot of these questions that we considered earlier now come in, and you can see kind of the force of where they come into play and why some people tend to prefer certain solutions over others. A couple other things to note about multiple attestation. One is that just because it's not multiply attested doesn't mean it's therefore unhistorical. It just means you can't use this criteria to help establish its historicity.
You just shoot yourself in the foot.
Right? So just because Garrett told Mark, told Mary, told Angela, and the only real witness to it is Garrett, doesn't mean it didn't happen. Right? Garrett may turn out to be reliable. He may not, Yeah. So just because it's not multiply attested doesn't mean it's therefore unhistorical. But it means that you can't really establish it by using this criteria. Does that make sense? Okay. And it's also worth noting that some scholars will apply this with regard to different genres of literature. Okay, so for example, even if within one gospel you have a theme, say, of caring for the poor, that shows up in a speech of Jesus and a parable, and then some story about him actually tending to the poor or something. you could say, well, there you've got it kind of multiply attested in different genres. And this kind of assumes that these stories circulated independently and then were brought together. So you can affirm, okay, Jesus cared about the poor. Now, you may not be able to affirm the historicity of any one of those particular things, but the overall, impact is that you can take away from that the idea that Jesus cared for the poor. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. The next criteria is dissimilarity. Okay. Now, there are different forms of dissimilarity. You can have something that's not in Judaism, but is in Jesus and is not in the church. You can have something that's in Judaism, in Jesus, and not in the church. You can have something that's not in Judaism, in Jesus, and in the church. And you can have something not in Judaism, not in Jesus, and not in the church. Okay? E.P. Sanders would say this is Dominic Crossan's Jesus. It's not in Judaism, not in Jesus, not in the church. We'll talk about him more in a few minutes. Which of these is the strongest form?
Jesus and Judaism.
Yes.
Yeah, or any that have the church with the X. Right? Why?
Because the church came after Jesus.
Well, who's preserving these stories? The church. Right? And so if something is in the church and you see it in Jesus, well, then there's always the possibility that it's in Jesus because it was useful to the church. Yeah, you get the mirror problem again.
Yes, mirror.
Right? So for example, and I think the example that I give you in the module was, Jesus being single. Okay? That's very odd in Judaism. Right? In Judaism, you are expected to get married and reproduce. That's the first command. Be fruitful and multiply. And if you're not multiplying, then they'll even split you up and pair you up with somebody else. Yeah. It's also not in the church. Now, Paul does, say it's great if you can be single, but even Paul admits most people should probably get married. Right? And when he does talk about being single, he doesn't ground it in Jesus' example. Right? So the church doesn't seem to have any vested interest in, saying Jesus was single. They don't make a big deal out of this. Right? So it would be very odd in Judaism. The church doesn't do anything with it, but yet we have this testimony that Jesus was single. Right? Which suggests that's probably true. Does that make sense? Okay. Well, what about something in Judaism, in Jesus, but not in the church? Well, what is Jesus' most common name for himself in the Synoptics? Son of Man. Right? He's always talking about what the Son of Man is going to do. Or be, or, all that stuff. Well, that is in Judaism, right? You have, Ezekiel, God says, hey, Son of Man, come over here. In Daniel, you get the one like a Son of Man. So you do have a precedent for this in Judaism. Does the early church do much with this? Not really. I mean, you read Acts, you read the epistles, they don't really play, Paul never talks about Jesus as Son of Man. If they're not doing anything with it, then why would they make up the idea that Jesus was always talking about himself as Son of Man? So what's the most likely reason that Jesus is always talking about himself as Son of Man in the Synoptic Gospels? Because he probably did that. Right? The church doesn't have any incentive to make that up. Does that make sense? And given that it would make sense, in the Jewish context, it fits. Okay? Now, an example of something that's not in Judaism, but is in Jesus and is in the church. Well, how about Jesus' divinity? Okay, did Judaism expect a divine human? No. Does the church talk about Jesus as also being God? Yes. Is Jesus portrayed as also being God? Yes. The question then is, well, is it because he was, or because the church found it convenient to portray him that way? Does that make sense? And here you can say, well, the church has a vested interest because that's a really important thing. Especially think about John and they have a vested interest. I mean, they're getting kicked out of the synagogue over this idea that Jesus is God. And so they write a gospel that shows him very clearly as God. Well, it's hard to argue for the historicity of that based on that because the church has an incentive to present him that way. Does that make sense? So you see how this criterion kind of gets applied? This can be a pretty powerful criterion to use, but what kind of Jesus do you get if you apply this as your primary criterion?
You get a heavenly Jesus, but no earth, no human piece of him.
Possibly. It might even go the other way. You get more human and less.
You get more human than divine.
But I mean, again, because because the church has an ability to kind of read things in. But you end up with a very fragmentary picture of Jesus who is not like Judaism or the church. Right? I mean, the things that you're saying are historical are the things that the church didn't carry on. And in some cases, were unique even in Judaism. So you end up with a Jesus who doesn't really fit in either. Does that make sense? Which again, kind of ends up with a Jesus who's not as relevant necessarily as we might like. Does that make sense? Because again, if the church is reading, because anything that the church carries on or becomes important to the church, the early church anyway, there's always a possibility that they, created the stories or made it up or read it in or
They molded the Jesus that they want. And we're still doing that today.
Yes. And so, but what happens then is anything that was important in the early church, which you got to think the early church, had a pretty good idea of what was important about Jesus. But if they thought it was important, then you can't establish that as historical based on this criterion. And so you end up, using this criterion with a Jesus who doesn't really fit in the church or in Judaism. Does that make sense? All right. Now there are a couple special forms of dissimilarity. Sometimes these are, treated as their own individual criteria. One is embarrassment. And the other is awkwardness. And again, the idea here is why would you make up a story that is awkward for you or embarrassing to you? Right?
Why would you make up a story that you forgot your Christ or couldn't understand who he was at one time?
Right.
It's too late unless it actually happened.
Right. So Jesus being conceived before his mother was married.
Yeah. That's it.
Right? Why would you make up something like that if it wasn't the case? Right? So the fact that what would seem more likely is that was historical and they had to try to explain it some way. And the answer they come up with, it was God that did it. Which you may think is historical or not. But the idea that she was probably pregnant before they consummated the marriage or officially got married, you wouldn't make up a story like that because it's just going to kind of cast you in a poor light, right? So that's the idea here. If you can find now the caveat here, we may find something embarrassing or awkward that they would not have back then, right? So we talked already about the eschatological language and Jesus talking about the end of the world and those kinds of things. Scholars around the turn of the 20th century found that stuff very awkward. Jews in the first century probably didn't. Right?
They were waiting for their comeuppance.
Yeah. So what you want to be able to do here is to establish not only that it's embarrassing or awkward, but that people back in the first century would have found it awkward or embarrassing.
In Gospel of John, John 13, Jesus is foot washing. And my understanding is that that was a first century practice, but it was done by servants. It was done by people who were paid or required to do that. To have the host of the meal, the Seder, do that. That was an example that I use as an awkward situation. And that's why Peter challenged him.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you're not supposed to do this.
Yeah, good. And there you've got Peter, fronting what you would expect to be the kind of, why are you doing this? This is not right. Right? Which suggests, yes, this is awkward. And they saw it as awkward. Right? That's a very good example. That's a very good example. Okay, so does that make sense? And it's not just that we would find it, maybe we wouldn't find it awkward, but there's evidence suggesting that they found it awkward. Right? And again, why would you make up a story that you then have to spend time trying to explain or justify or anything like that? All right?
And we have whole denominations that are established for football.
Yes.
When it was just something that they did as a part of the social graces of etiquette of the time.
Yes. All right. The third one that you'll see invoked sometimes is memorable content or form. Okay, and this one is often applied in the negative. What are the odds that someone remembered verbatim the Sermon on the Mount? Very unlikely. Yeah.
Yeah, I was making the argument though, it's like if you say something that people consider shocking in front of a crowd, then they're likely to remember it.
Yes.
Or if you say something unexpected, it's like if you were to misplace one word in the Star Spangled Banner or the Pledge of Allegiance in front of a crowd in the Super Bowl, you're going to get mad and they'll pick up on that.
Yes. Yeah, so you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. People are going to remember that.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's something that, okay, yeah, that is likely, that's memorable. And it's short. Right? All of John 3? No. Someone's not going to remember that verbatim. Okay? This one gets applied a lot to parables. This is why a lot of historical Jesus scholars like parables, because they're short, they're memorable. You could see someone remembering that verbatim. Right? Okay? The next one, language and environment. Okay? Most scholars think Jesus probably spoke Aramaic. So, if you have things... Well, yes, but he would then translate it for, the people
And he
there.
only spoke in red.
Yes. Yes, he spoke in red, exactly. So, if you find a scroll that talks about Jesus getting in his car and driving to Target, you know that that's probably not authentic.
Not even in the message Bible.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yep. Yeah. So you've got to, does this make sense in the context, right? And if it doesn't, then you're probably not in touch with something historical. Another one that gets invoked is explanation. If this is historical, does it help explain otherwise confusing aspects? And this especially gets invoked with regard to his death. If something can help explain why these people wanted to put Jesus to death so badly, then that is regarded as having a good claim on historicity. And then finally, coherence. Given all of the things you can establish through these other things, if you then have other things that fit with that picture, it's more likely to be historical than something that doesn't fit. Okay? And so this is used to kind of help fill out the picture. Because again, the just applying the criteria, you tend to get a very fragmentary thing. Sorry. Okay? So, if you have your synopsis, people have your synopsis? If you have your synopsis, or you can find someone near you who does, look at Elan 18 and evaluate the historicity of Jesus' baptism. Okay, a parishioner comes up and says, I have to know, was Jesus baptized by John? All right? And it's up to you to now make an argument. Do you think he was baptized by John or not? Is that historical or not? All right, and think in terms of these criteria. Okay?
These similarities, a lot of times, because that you are
It's gonna be wrong no matter what.
That's what those men learned that same. No, I'm just saying that he's a tiger. There are occasions that he baptized. John baptized. That's not it. I'm just saying that it's not remarkable
You got it? All right. All right, take another minute or so.
Yeah, the Jordan was a trick. How could he be immersed in just a trick? I mean, I've seen pictures of the Jordan. It's pretty deep. Wow. Fast flowing. I wonder if John lost it. I catching up and see that.
Not only after 80 hours out,
Yeah.
you'll be baptized forever.
All right, let's come back together. How many think it's historical that Jesus was baptized by John? Everybody does. All right.
Somebody that was closely named John.
So, someone make an argument. Yeah. Everybody thinks it's historical. Why?
There was less of multiple attestation.
Okay, well, let's start with multiple attestation. How many attestations do we have?
We think we have two.
Where?
We think that the synoptics are using Mark,
Okay.
okay? But we think John's way of giving us almost similar language is not, there's extra in John.
So you think John is independent of the synoptics
Yes.
in this passage? Okay. Does John actually talk about him being baptized?
No.
No. John bore witness, I saw the Spirit descend as a dove from heaven, and it remained on him. I myself did not know him, but he who sent me to baptize with water said to me, He on whom you see the Spirit descend and remain, this is he who baptizes with the Holy Spirit.
Now, would you not look at verse 31? I myself did not know him, but for this I came baptizing with water, that he might be revealed to Israel. So the baptism piece, the action, the role happens there, and that is before Jesus. There are other baptizers in the area.
Yeah, but it never says he baptizes Jesus. Right? It talks about how John came baptizing, so it could support the idea that John baptized, but it never actually says he baptized Jesus. Right?
There are multiple attestments of a spirit descending, and John is separate from Mark. And that could be Jesus, all right?
Well, but it could be John's there baptizing, and all of a sudden he sees the Spirit come down on this guy over here. Right? I mean, if all you had was John, you wouldn't know that Jesus was baptized.
Well, how about awkwardness?
How about what?
How about awkwardness? Would it be weird that God would need to be baptized by Jesus?
Okay, good. We'll get to that in just a second. All right? So multiple attestation doesn't really help us here. Because it's in Mark, and most scholars think that Luke and Matthew are both using Mark. So we've got it attested in Mark, but that's about it. All right? Again, John may be independent here, but John doesn't actually say he baptized him, or even that Jesus was baptized.
As you said, even though you don't have multiple facets,
Right.
it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right.
Okay, so that's the false negative. false positive.
But we wouldn't want to go to that.
Well, it just means that you can't help establish historicity based on multiple attestation. If we're making a case for historicity, that's not going to be a criterion that we use.
We want to use embarrassment or awkwardness. Something else.
Okay, so let's talk about embarrassment or awkwardness. Does that help us establish historicity?
I think so.
Yes.
Why?
Why would you make up something awkward?
Well, what's awkward about it?
That a human being is baptizing who was supposed to be God.
Okay,
I agree with that.
and what does it say baptism for?
Repentance of sin.
Sins.
Yeah,
And if Jesus is God, then he is.
I thought he was supposed to be sinless. Why does Jesus need to be baptized? Right? Now, we can see the awkwardness in that, but did they?
Because had he claimed yet to be Son of God at that point?
They
Well,
gave the voice that this is the Son of God.
Only after.
So that there is that, but would they have seen this embarrassing or awkward for Jesus to be baptized by John?
No.
Probably not, since they all liked John a lot and thought that he probably was the Messiah.
Well, look what happens. Mark seems to be the earliest, right? I think most of us are agreed on that. How does Mark portray it? Verse 9. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Pretty straightforward, right? What does Matthew do with that? Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to John to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? But Jesus answered him, let it be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. Then he consented. What is John doing? Or what is Matthew doing here?
Explaining why John would be.
Yeah, he's fronting the awkwardness and then saying, it's okay, we got it covered. Right? How does Luke handle the awkwardness?
He avoids something, right? Just leaves it out.
He does.
He does.
Well, now when all the people were baptized and when Jesus also had been baptized, he turns it into a passive. Right? And kind of, just elides over John's role. Just kind of forgets about John. Maybe if we don't mention it, people won't, think about that. So here you could argue you have two different ways of kind of minimizing or confronting the awkwardness that Jesus was baptized by John. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Matthew, fronts the awkwardness, front and center, and then deals with it. No, it's all right. Luke just tries to minimize it and shuffle it off to the side. And what do you get then in John? He doesn't even mention the baptism. Right? He mentions all the stuff around the baptism, but he doesn't mention the baptism at all.
Because Jesus is God.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a little awkward for the sinless God to need to be baptized by, a sinful human. With a baptism for the forgiveness of sins. Right? So there's evidence here that not only is it awkward, but they found it awkward. Does that make sense? And again, the question then is, why would you make up the story of John baptizing Jesus if it didn't happen? Because it creates all kinds of awkward problems for who you think Jesus is that he did this.
Amen.
Okay, I know we're talking about Jesus at this point, but what I was saying that I also found awkward was John himself. Because you have John's father is a high priest. He's allowed to be a high priest. But yet God transformed his life. He's now in the wilderness instead of being brought up as the next high priest.
Well, his father wasn't a high priest, but he was a priest.
A priest, okay.
Yeah.
So, but he's inclined to be a temple priest if he stayed on that path. But look at the drastic change in
He became like the Essenes.
wilderness, wearing camel hair, eating locusts. He's in the Jordan baptizing, and lo and behold, he is baptizing God.
Mm-hmm.
That is awful.
Well, now think about this. What about the idea that he was, that John was dressed in camel hair and ate locusts and those kinds of things?
I said it was.
Is that likely historical or not?
Isn't that part of the Nazarenes? The
Is that an Old
sect that he
Testament
belonged
tie
to?
parallel?
There is an Old Testament parallel, and that then gets you into the question of, well, is the church just framing it that way to help you make an Old Testament connection? Right? Anytime there's an Old Testament fulfillment, there's always the possibility the church has just shaped it that way to make it look like it's fulfilling the Old Testament or connecting it with something in the Old Testament.
But it was a sect that existed. I mean, I know Samson was from.
The Nazarites?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, though it's not clear that John was a Nazarite.
But
He
he dressed like a Nazarite, according to what we learned from about the Old Testament. About Samson.
Well, he dressed like Elijah.
Okay.
He dressed like Elijah. Elijah always walked around in a hair shirt. And,
The bug thing, though, is what gets me. It's like, trust this man. That man over there eating bugs.
yeah.
He's got good facts.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When he
So we find that awkward. The question then is, would they have found that awkward, or they've had, wow. Yeah,
It's
he's-
approaching.
yeah, exactly.
I did grasshopper.
They had to find it awkward because the Pharisees went out and asked him, "Who are you? Are you the Christ?" It's also that he is baptizing so many people. Not only just the Christ, but the fact that he is.
Well, but remember, there were all sorts of messianic people who arose and did kind of prophetic acts, and so that wouldn't be so unusual. And again, the chief priests and the Pharisees and Sadducees come out because they want to investigate and figure out, okay, what's going on in this case? Is this something legitimate, or is this something that is another scam job?
So since these people know that he is John the Baptist, I'm just thinking, logically, they would know who his father was. That's
Mhm.
right. Why is the son out in the wilderness, dressed in camel hair and eating bugs, when he's next in line to become this?
Really trying to get home.
Yep. He chose a different path. Yes. All right. But do you see how you can kind of apply these criteria to try to come to some solutions?
I think it's very helpful. As we were talking about earlier, just trying to keep this foundation of truth, and it will last through time.
Yeah,
You can always rely on that.
And so most scholars would say, the fact that Jesus was baptized by John is probably one of the most sure things we can know about Jesus. Right? Because it's so awkward and embarrassing. Why in the world would they have invented that story if it didn't happen? And again, you can see different ways of even within the Gospels of them trying to deal with the awkwardness.
Are there extra biblical writings that have claim to John baptizing in the Jordan at this time?
Josephus talks about
That's
John. Yeah. Yeah.
Josephus, Flavius, or weird Flavius Josephus.
Flavius Josephus. Yeah. Yep. All right. So your weekly task for this week. How many did the weekly task? All right. So did Jesus talk about the 12? Is that historical, or is that something made up?
I said it was. I said it was.
All right.
It bridged back to the Old Testament.
It does. It does. Does that make it more likely or less likely to be historical?
Probably less likely. But what I use.
It raises the possibility that the church created that 12 in order to just make a connection with the 12 tribes. Right? So anytime you get an Old Testament kind of fulfillment, or there's always the possibility the church created it to make that connection.
I see in 2 points.
Right? So, but what else do we have?
I thought there was multiple attestations.
Where?
In the fact that they're mentioned in all the names of the 12 are mentioned in the Gospels.
Okay, and it's different. It's a different 12 names.
And then what the thing that I thought was the biggest factor was the awkwardness and embarrassment of denying the Christ, not understanding who he was the whole time, betraying him, Judas. Why would you?
Judah, yeah. Why would you create a story where one of his 12 most intimate followers is the one who betrays him?
And you
Right.
get confirmation in Acts that at some point 12 existed as a core group, because there's an election of Matthias in Acts 1.
Okay, good. So we get Acts. Though Acts is probably written by Luke, which, and Luke and Matthew and Martin. There's another reference.
But the sending out the seven-
Paul. Where does Paul refer to it?
Paul had a lot of interaction with Peter.
Okay, but where does Paul talk about the 12?
When he left for 2 years, when he said that they did not accept him. Well, they did accept him at first.
Well, in Galatians, he kind of traces out, I didn't go to Jerusalem, and then when I went, I didn't see anybody. Well, okay, I saw Peter. Okay, I saw James too, but that was it. I didn't see anybody else. And but he doesn't talk about the 12 there.
Oh, you mean all 12.
Well, the key thing is the name the 12, right? 1 Corinthians 15. He's going through the ones who Jesus appeared to. Starting with verse 4. He was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12.
Okay, 1 Corinthians 15:4.
15, 5 is where he actually mentions the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as it were, to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. All right, so here you have Paul referring to the 12. And does Paul have any incentive to recognize the 12? No. Because if anything, it just reminds people, I'm not one of them. Right? I mean, he's not one of the 12. So Paul has no incentive to kind of make up this idea that there were the 12, that they were known as the 12. So here you do get multiple attestation. You do get awkwardness and embarrassment of Judas, one of his most intimate, being the one who betrays. And then they have to replenish, right? As Angela mentioned in Acts, they've got to fill it back up because we're down one now.
Yeah, they actually have much.
And what's really curious is Paul still speaks about the 12 even after Judas is gone. Right? I mean, you might think it'd be the 11 now. But he still calls them the 12. Right? So that suggests Jesus did probably talk about the 12. Now, E.P. Sanders, who we'll talk about more in a minute, he suggests that it was probably the number that was more important than the actual individuals, and it may have rotated.
Yeah.
And that's why you get different lists in different Gospels. Someone's father gets sick, and they got to go home. Okay, well, he's out, next person up. Just like at the end when Judas is out. All right, well, who's the next one? Matthias. Come on in. You're the next contestant on, be a disciple.
The disciples are right.
Yes. Okay.
There are other numbers that are mentioned in the gospel, like in Luke with the 70 plus 2, and I always felt as if there was a board of directors. When he went to the Mount of Transfiguration, you had Peter, James, and John. They often were with him without the others.
Right.
And
There's the inner circle, and then the somewhat wider circle, and then the more general disciples, and then the crowds.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're kind of over concentric circles. Yeah.
So, if there were more than 12, say what he said, he commissioned and sent out the 70 plus 2. I mean, they were there to be commissioned. They were there seeing the miracles. So I looked at it as, there were more than 12.
Well, why 70?
There's 35 pairs.
Goes back to Genesis and the table of nations, where there's 70. And so you're again, you have a significant number that's making connections
Right. It's a red
back.
line.
Yeah.
But yes, he had more than 12.
Right. There were more than just 12 that kind of went around with him.
If you
As is
have
evidence.
people going through a grain field, you're gonna cause
A
significant
little
damage.
trampling.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we know there are more than just the 12 around him, because at the end, when Judas is gone, Mattathias is there to be chosen from among, a couple of candidates who's been with them from the beginning. So there has to have been some disciples who were not part of the 12, but who were nevertheless, following along with Jesus.
And you had others, like on the road to Emmaus, where Jesus, after the resurrection,
Mhm.
is supposed to be with this group, and they're just talking about an intimate relationship with Jesus, and telling this man that they've met all about Jesus. And so they had to be more than just followers. It appeared as if they had a real connection.
Mm-hmm. So there do seem to be more than just 12, but Jesus does seem to have talked about the 12. Okay, does that make sense? And again, you can see how you can kind of go through the criterion and make an argument for the historicity. And again, it's worth noting there are significant implications of the number 12. It does connect back with the 12 tribes. That doesn't help establish historicity, though. Because again, anytime you have significance, there's always the possibility that someone has created that for the significance. But if you can establish it on other grounds, then you can pull in the significance and talk about that. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. So for this second part of our historical Jesus work, what I want to do is just go through some of the scholars who have done historical Jesus work and talk about kind of what their Jesus looks like. Okay? So again, these are the criteria that we've just been working at. How many people remember the Jesus Seminar? This was back in the 80s. The Jesus Seminar was a group of scholars that got together and decided, you know what? The academy and the church are too separated. And so what they wanted to do was try to bring the findings of the academy to the awareness of the general public. And so they were very keen on media, okay, and wanting to get big publicity for all of their findings. All right? So what they did was they called in a bunch of scholars, and then they would write papers and debate about various sayings and deeds of Jesus, and then they would vote. And then based on the vote, they would determine whether or not they thought that this was something Jesus had done. And again, this was all done in ways that were designed to kind of attract the biggest media pull. All right? So, what were their principles that they worked on? Well, they considered all sources. The canonical Gospels did not get special consideration. Okay, so all the other Gospels that are out there, and they all got considered. So the Gospel of Thomas, for example, is a big one. Now, part of this depends on how you date these things, right? Some people think Gospel of Thomas is early. I think it's probably later. Well, how you decide that question is going to determine how useful it is for getting in touch with the historical Jesus. Okay? The way they would vote is with beads. Red means it's authentic. Pink is maybe yes. Gray, maybe no. And black, definitely not. All right? And this was key because of the red letter Bibles, and again, they're looking for media, cachet. So after they voted, they figured out that 18% of the sayings attributed to Jesus were likely authentic. And most of them are of this generic proverbial wisdom type. Okay? So for example, the saying that they found most likely to be authentic is Matthew 5:39, which reads, But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. All right? And the second most likely historical saying attributed to Jesus is the next verse. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. All right? Then, one from Luke gets in there, but then the fourth one is the next verse. Whoever shall force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Okay? And then you got 2 from Luke 6 that kind of round out the top 5. You'll notice these are all short, which makes them easily memorable. They're aphoristic, and they kind of fit with the theology that most of these scholars embrace, meaning they're kind of basic wisdom sayings. Okay? After they went through the sayings, then they went through the deeds of Jesus, and they determined about 16% of those were authentic. Okay? And for the Jesus seminar, if it's unverifiable, then it's inauthentic. Right? So if you cannot make a strong case for its historicity, then you got to say it's inauthentic, which is somewhat awkward. All right? Here is a list of their final sayings. In Matthew, there are 420 sayings. They found 11 of them to be authentic. 60 may be authentic, 115 probably not, and 234 absolutely not. Yes.
Are we getting back to the Jeffersonian Bible? Just pick and choose it?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Pretty much. In Mark, out of 177 sayings, there is 1 authentic. 18 possibly authentic, 66 probably not, and 92 no way.
Which one was the other?
I don't remember off the top of my head. In Luke,
Was Mark 5:41.
Matthew.
Okay.
It's Matthew. Yeah, Matthew and Luke had the top 5. In Luke, out of 392 sayings, 14 were authentic, 65 maybe, 128 probably not, and 185 absolutely not. In John, now remember I told you John kind of got shoved to the side, and as far as no authentic sayings in John. 1 that was maybe, 5 probably not, and 134 out of 140 sayings absolutely not. Right? Thomas, out of 201 sayings, 3 were authentic, so more than John and Mark put together. 40 maybe, 67 probably not, and 91 absolutely not.
Were any of these hanging checks?
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of them were just on the border, and they called for a recount. Now, in general, the Jesus Seminar has not been well received by the Academy. They have been critiqued in part on their membership. There are a couple big-name scholars that were involved in this: John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, Robert Funk. But a lot of them were kind of second-tier scholars, mainly at liberal schools. They also pulled in some other people like Paul Verhoeven, who was the director of Basic Instinct and Showgirls, which led some to raise, why is this guy, deciding what Jesus said? What is his qualification for this? So there's also some confusion as to what gray means. Is gray kind of probably not, or, well, maybe, but not as firm as pink? They've also been accused of kind of starting with their assumptions are things that should have been conclusions, right? So, for example, they start off with the assumption that John includes very little that is historical. Well, if that's your starting assumption, is it any surprise that you end up with John having very little historical in it? So their operating assumptions have been questioned. Okay? Yeah, you don't hear about them too much anymore. Occasionally, again around Easter, Time Magazine will run a spread.
They're probably the same people who did this God did. There was a,
Oh, the movie?
no, there was a group that had God is dead. And they were from.
Yeah. Well, and again, a lot of these scholars, the Jesus that emerges from this group looks a lot like the scholars in that group
No.
in terms of having the same concerns, and so we're back to Schweitzer's problem.
Yeah.
Um,
And always, in any test, any statistic, look who funded the
Right.
test.
Just like, a few years ago, well, it's probably more than a few now, but they did this scientific portrait of Jesus based upon, what we knew about Jews at the time, and so getting rid of the kind of Jesus of Nazareth movie Jesus that blue eyes and all that. And so they came out with this portrait of this is what Jesus most likely looked like, given kind of common, and everyone thought, oh wow, this is really great, until they saw the guy that did it, and it looks exactly like the guy that did it. It's like, oh, come on. So surprise, surprise. You tend to find what you're looking for. Yes.
I'm just researching this stuff. It said the scholars of the Jesus Seminary did not believe that the deity of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, the death of Christ, or the substitutionary atonement death of Christ. So,
Yeah, for the most part, they don't.
okay, so all this stuff is.
And so that's why they like the kind of wisdom sayings, like, turn the other cheek, and if someone needs your shirt, give them, 2, or, if someone asks you to walk a mile, walk 2. They like those kind of saying, and so Jesus comes out looking kind of like a 60s hippie kind of,
That's
kind of
not
guy.
definitive as answering the question, when did you stop meeting your wife? Yesterday, or I haven't. What? Oh wait, you're continuing to meet your wife? Okay, that's a red. How
Yeah.
are the questions framed?
Yeah, and so there have been a lot of critique. As I say, most scholars in the academy are not very impressed with their work. But again, they got big splashes in the media because and all of these would be tied to a big media release. Only 18% of the sayings of Jesus are actually authentic. So everything they did was kind of designed to get a big splash in the media to get these scholarly results out in the church and kind of bridge that divide.
They got all these scriptures here to prove what they're saying. So that's the kind. They stored in the scriptures when they put stuff in there like 2 Timothy 3:16 through 17, saying that the Holy Spirit is not the author of the scriptures and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they're not concerned about that. I mean, do you get a distorted picture of Jesus? Absolutely. Right? Absolutely. The Jesus that they come up with does not look like the Jesus that you meet in the Gospels. They just kind of picked out the parts that they liked and ended up with a Jesus that looked a lot like them. Okay, which is something we've seen happen again and again, which we do today too, right? We assume that Jesus has the same stance on issues that we do. But we usually phrase it, well, I have that stance because that's the stance Jesus would take. Right, yeah. But surprisingly, Jesus agrees with us. Whoever
Jesus likes
we
the
are.
Steelers more than he likes the Cubs.
Yeah. Well, that's a given. All right. All right. One of the scholars who was part of the Jesus Seminar, but also kind of does his own stuff in historical Jesus, is John Dominic Crossan. If you've ever watched the History Channel or Discovery Channel, he appears on a lot of those documentaries about ancient times.
Like that's about anything.
Yeah. For Crossan, method is really important. Okay, and so he comes up with a particular method, and it is this: you start by giving every saying or tradition or whatever a score, and the score is composed of its source strata, and the number of independent attestations that we have. Okay? So for example, a 1-4 score would be really good because it's the earliest strata and it's attested 4 times independently. Okay? So that would be a really good score for something being historical. All right? Does that make sense? Secondly, he says you've got to reconstruct the first century Greco-Roman Jewish world. And for Crossan, the Greco-Roman part plays a much bigger role than the Jewish part. Okay, his book about Jesus is titled Mediterranean Peasant. And so he's very much trying to put Jesus in the context of the Mediterranean culture of that time. I would argue the Jewish context is probably a bit more important. But, you know, he plays that one up. Yeah, and then he says you have to apply social and cultural anthropology to Jesus' actions, right? What we know through sociology and anthropology to try and understand what Jesus is doing and how he's going about it, okay? So this is his method, all right, which on the surface looks pretty good, right? You kind of evaluate, you know, how early they are and how well attested they are. You try to put Jesus in his historical context, and then you try to apply insights from other disciplines to make sense of what he's doing. But as with all of these methods, they're easily manipulable, right? It depends a lot, you know, your score depends a lot on what you put in each strata, okay? So for Crossan, his earliest strata includes Q, most of Thomas, and something he reconstructed that he calls the cross gospel.
So we got Q2.
Right, which you know some call facetiously the Crossan gospel. Yeah, I mean this isn't even, you know, a document we have. It's something he reconstructed, you know, an earlier form of something that we do have. Well, if that's your earliest strata, your Jesus is going to come out looking very different than if you take, say, the canonical Gospels as your earliest strata. Right? Now, one of the, well, we'll get to that in a minute. So what does his Jesus look like? Well, he says that Jesus started out as an apocalyptic disciple of John, but he later broke with him. Okay? And that's why, you know, Jesus says in Matthew 11, John is the least of those in the kingdom. That means he broke with John. He doesn't like John anymore. Off his Christmas card list.
You can join the stand.
Yeah, exactly. Now, for Crossan, what Jesus was really all about, well, you probably picked this up already, but brokerage. Right? Didn't you get that from reading the Gospels? This is why Sanders says, you know, not in Judaism, not in Jesus, not in the church. Yeah, what Jesus is all about is brokerage or mediated hierarchy. And what Jesus is seeking is through magic and meals. See the alliteration there? Yeah, magic and meals to usher in a brokerless kingdom in which everyone has direct access to God. Okay? So, again, the two ways Jesus goes about doing this is by meals. So he would eat with anybody and everybody. And, you know, in the Gospels you get people, why is you eating with them? You know, we don't eat with those people. And then magic. And he's very intentional to say magic here and not miracles. Because miracles are things that come through the officially sanctioned channels. Magic is what's done outside of the officially sanctioned channels. And what Jesus is doing is magic. Because he's going around and saying, oh, you've got an illness? You don't need to go to the temple and have them pray for you. You can be in touch with God right here. Be healed. And he's all better. Right? So what Jesus is trying to usher in is a brokerless kingdom where you don't have to go through the hierarchy. All right?
Yeah, the church really had a problem with that too.
He's a former priest.
Really?
Yes.
So
You could have never guessed that from what he comes up with. right? Yeah, brokerage. That's what Jesus was all about. So, one of his reasons for the Gospel of Thomas has a saying in there about how the temple has been destroyed and it will never be built again. Okay? Most scholars see that as an indication that is late, right? Because there's no longer a hope that it's actually going to be rebuilt. So enough time must have passed that people are now convinced that it's not going to happen. All right? Crossan takes that as an indication that Thomas is early. Why? Because Jesus is all about brokerage.
He didn't. Did Crossan believe in the resurrection?
Well, this is interesting.
Because if he did not believe in the resurrection, then the temple will be raised in 3 days.
According to Crossan, what happens to Jesus' body? It was eaten by dogs.
No, dogs.
Yeah. Eaten by dogs. Yes. Now he admits we don't actually know that it was eaten by dogs. But that's his point. We don't know what happened to it, and it might as easily been eaten by dogs as anything else. So.
Crossan's not going to be on the final, right?
Right. This is in historical Jesus, right? Again, you'll probably want to, go read a bit more so you can preach it on Sunday.
Oh,
Right?
we're having communion on Sunday, so we're having doctrine.
Yeah. Exactly.
I'm sorry. Oh, Father, forgive me.
Right. So he thinks that saying in Thomas is early because it's saying the temple's going to be destroyed and not be, in other words, the brokerage system is going to be taken out. And that's what Jesus was all about, and therefore that's got to be early because it's authentic. Right? So even if you have a seemingly strong method, there's still a lot of room to shape and manipulate the results you're going to end up with.
Isn't that the entire theme of what we have as Scripture now? Each of us can look at the same Scripture and come up with our own, this is how I see it, this is how I see it. And so we're all in this conundrum of making the Bible what...
Yes, which is why we need one another.
Yeah.
Right? Because what I see may not be what you see, but that doesn't mean we're both right.
And when you go Lone Ranger, you really go off the deep end. But when you have collective, you're kind of, no, you need to come back in this way.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the hope, that in having these conversations, we can come to an agreement about what the text is actually saying. Right?
It goes back to the dirge and the dance.
Exactly.
Okay, all right.
Exactly.
What is the year of his work? When was this published?
Crossan? I think 90s. Yeah.
Before social media.
Yeah. Though again, you can still find him on the History Channel, and he's got a very bubbly voice, and a lot of people say he's a very entertaining speaker and writer. You can read his stuff for yourself and see if you.
Well, the more, like you said, the source strata, the odder it is and the weirder it is, you're going to get people to go, hey, let's listen to him and see what he's got to say.
Yeah.
Not just all.
Well, and Crossan says, and look, I can explain why Jesus gets killed. Because he's against the establishment. Right? His whole thing is fighting against the establishment, saying we don't need you.
Okay.
Right? And that's why the establishment, kind of like Trump. Right?
Yeah.
So the what?
American.
Yeah, that's him.
Ooh, Jesus.
Right?
I'll tell you.
All right. The next one, E.P. Sanders. And E.P. Sanders, he was at Duke. He was one of my professors. He differs from a lot of the other scholars in that he says he's going to start with the deeds of Jesus. And he tries to come up with a list of, what are the things we can say are most likely true about Jesus, and then we'll kind of build from there. Okay? So his list of core things that we can say about Jesus. 1, Jesus was baptized by John. Okay, we just looked at that, a few minutes ago. We understand all that. 2, Jesus called disciples and spoke of there being 12. All right, we talked about that too. 3, Jesus confined his activity to Israel. Okay, he didn't go out, trying to witness to the nations. 4, Jesus was a Galilean who preached and healed. Okay, even the rabbis acknowledge Jesus as a miracle worker. Okay, and one of the things Sanders says was, if your enemies are saying something about you like that, that has more credence than if you're people who are on your side. Okay. 5, Jesus engaged in controversy about the temple. Okay. He seems to have made some kind of statement about destroying the temple, which ends up getting him killed, according to the Gospels. 6, Jesus was crucified outside Jerusalem by Roman authorities. Okay? And 7, after his death, Jesus' followers continued as an identifiable movement. All right, and then his final one, at least some Jews persecuted at least some parts of this new movement. Okay? So now we're getting a picture of Jesus that's probably a little bit closer to what we're used to, right? Sanders, unlike Crossan and the Jesus Seminar, is giving priority to the canonical Gospels, right? He thinks not because they're canonical, but because he thinks those are the most reliable and earliest witnesses that we have. Okay. So he also suggests Jesus' thing in the temple. Sanders is really good about thinking through practically how things would have happened. Okay, or how would this have happened, and is this likely to have functioned in practice? Okay. So and he's also one who tries to put Jesus in his Jewish context. Okay, unlike Crossan, who's emphasizing the Greco-Roman context, Sanders emphasizes the Jewish context, and Sanders is very well versed in the Jewish context. With regard to Jesus' activity in the temple, when he goes over and overturns the tables, he thinks through, how would Jesus have done this? Because the temple is huge, right? There's no way one guy could stop all traffic in the outer court. Just not possible. And no Romans come up and arrest him. Right? So Sanders says the idea that Jesus kind of put a halt to all activity in the outer court just doesn't make sense. What this likely was a prophetic demonstration of the coming destruction. Okay? So it's a small, localized thing where he does turn over some tables and, whip out get his whip going and things like that. But it's localized. And the purpose, it's not a cleansing. You often see a little heading in your Bible, the cleansing of the temple. So this isn't cleansing. It's not like if they just shaped up, then things would be okay. This is instead a prophetic sign of the coming destruction. Mm-hmm.
Now, I know with the Roman authority,
Well, they got the sword, so they can kind of do whatever they want. In general, they tried to respect Jewish,
Okay.
I think.
That's what I thought.
But remember, this is the outer court. This is the court of the Gentiles, where Jesus is doing this. So they're not, proceeding into the temple. This would just be the outer courts. And remember, especially at festival time, the Romans got especially vigilant. And they would come down, the governor or the prefect, procurator would take up his, he would move into the palace, which was stationed right over the temple. So they could, keep an eye on everything. And because what you didn't want was a mob to start forming and revolt break out.
Any uprising would be squashed pretty quick.
Yes. And so aware of that, Sanders says, how could he be, stopping all activity and creating this huge ruckus and no Roman shows up at all? He's able to just walk away after this.
They did walk along when they told them.
Yeah. All right. So does that make sense? So Sanders is very much about thinking through the practicalities of things and how this would work. Okay. John Meyer, that was a scholar at Notre Dame. He and Sanders are probably the closest of any two on this list that we're going through. John Meyer was writing a commentary on Matthew, I think, and was doing his kind of introductory issues and had to deal with historical Jesus. And 5 or 6 volumes later, he's still going. What Meyer does is he proposes that we envision an unpapal conclave. That's what he calls it. And so what we're going to do is we are going to take a Jew, a Protestant, a Catholic, and an atheist and lock them in the basement of Harvard Divinity School and say, you cannot come out until you have come to agreement about the historical Jesus. Okay? And so what he does is for any point he goes through and he says, okay, well, what would the Catholic perspective, what would the Catholic person say about this? What would the atheist say about this? What would the Jewish person say about this? What would the Protestant say about this? And if you can find something that they could all agree on, then you're likely in touch with something that's historical. Okay? So he's very methodical about, you may not agree with him, but if you disagree, you know exactly where you disagree. Like, oh, no, right here, I can't make that step. Okay, because he lays it all out in copious detail. He also recognizes there is a distinction between the historical Jesus and the real Jesus. The real Jesus is by definition going to be much bigger and fuller than we could ever prove historically. Right? What we are able to prove historically about any individual in the ancient world is necessarily going to be more limited than what they were actually like. Does that make sense? So he acknowledges we're after the historical Jesus, but that's different than the real Jesus. And I think that's a helpful distinction to make. Okay? He employs criteria, and he says they are important because they introduce a measure of objectivity. What that means is that if your criteria never lead you to change your mind, then you're not employing them very well or you don't have very good criteria. Okay? So the criteria, if you're really using them objectively, they have to, something you thought was historical, you end up saying, no, it's probably not. Or something you didn't think was historical, you run it through the criteria and say, well, no, I think that actually is. Okay? For Meyer, he argues that Jesus is a marginal Jew. Okay? And this is where he and Sanders kind of differ the most. Sanders is looking at Jesus as a typical Jew and trying to put him within Judaism. Meyer is also putting him within Judaism, but seeing him as someone on the boundaries, on the outskirts, on the margins. Okay? So, for example, Jesus was celibate, which, as we talked about, was very unusual. He's unmarried. He's single. So he emphasizes kind of the distinctives of Jesus, whereas Sanders kind of emphasizes the commonalities that he has. He also likes M's, just like Crossan and his magic and meals. But Meyer's M's, the first one is the mentor. John the Baptist had the greatest influence on Jesus, according to Meyer. Yes, J-Bab. In terms of message, he says the kingdom of God emphasis is distinctive with Jesus. In the synoptics, that's what Jesus preaches most of all, the kingdom of God. But he concludes that Matthew 10:23, Mark 9:1, and 13:30 are all early church creations. They don't go back to Jesus. Now, if you remember, Matthew 10:23 is where Jesus sends out the disciples and then says, before you finish going through all the towns of Israel, or you will not finish going through all of it before the Son of Man comes. Most scholars think that's likely authentic because it seems Jesus was wrong. Right? The disciples all come back. And the Son of Man is not come, or not come in any greater way than he was there before. So again, it seems awkward. And if it's awkward, then why would you create a saying like that? Okay. Similarly, Mark 9:1. He was saying to them, "Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who shall not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power." To regard as wrong and therefore historical. And then 13:30, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Right? And he's just gone through and talked about the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory, sending forth his angels, gathering the elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of earth to the farthest end of heaven. But Meyer puts them through his criteria and determines, no, I think these are actually creations of the early church. All right, as opposed to being historical because they're awkward and wrong. So this is an instance where his criteria have convinced him of a conclusion that he didn't hold at the beginning. All right, and he says that's the indication that you're truly using them objectively. And again, you can go read his discussion of those things if you want to know how he reaches that conclusion. And then his third M, his final M, is miracles. He says Jesus did them, which is different from many historical Jesus scholars who don't believe miracles actually are possible. But he says Jesus did them, including 3 from John: the paralytic at Bethesda, the man born blind, and the raising of Lazarus. And again, Meyer has probably done more to rehabilitate John as a historical source than any other scholar. Okay? And as we said, he's closest to Sanders, but his Jesus did have disputes over the law. Again, he's kind of emphasizing Jesus' marginality. He saw the kingdom of God as in some sense presence and was unique. Okay? And Sanders kind of takes the different. Jesus was law-abiding and didn't have a problem with the law. Jesus saw the kingdom of God as something that was still coming. And, Sanders, again, emphasizes his commonality with other Jews as opposed to his uniqueness. All right? Make sense? Yeah.
The mentor part.
Yes.
About, John the Baptist has the greatest influence on Jesus. I don't even think about anybody having an influence.
Well, for Meyer, Jesus, and for many of these scholars actually, Jesus starts out as a disciple of John the Baptist. And because again, John baptizes him. And so that to most of them suggests that he's part of John's movement, which means he's under John's leadership. Now again, for Crossan, he ends up breaking with John and
Yeah, because I thought after the baptism, he kind of went on his own, but that baptism was just like a visual, something for the people to see, nothing Jesus an influence. I don't see anybody having influence like this influence came.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And I'm not suggesting you necessarily embrace the
No, I know.
Jesus, but yeah.
I'm just saying.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good point. It's a good point. It's a good point. Okay. All right. N.T. Wright. Have people heard of him? Yes. So N.T. Wright proposes a completely different way of going about historical Jesus work. And he introduces what he calls critical realism, which is a method of hypothesis and verification. And you are seeking a consistent picture that can account for the most data. Okay? Now, right there, you've got some scholars who will push back and say, why in the world are you trying to account for most data when most of the data is late and bad? Right? But Wright says no, and he's going to emphasize the canonical Gospels, particularly the Synoptics. Not as much John, more the Synoptics. He says you have to answer several key questions. 1, how does Jesus fit into Judaism? 2, what were Jesus' aims? 3, why did Jesus die? 4, how and why did the early church begin? And 5, why are the Gospels what they are? Okay? And so for Wright, you need an answer that can, or you need an explanation that can answer these questions. Okay? He comes up with a new criterion to what he calls the double criterion of similarity and dissimilarity. What does he mean by that? Well, something that is credible in Judaism and credible as a starting point for later Christianity means that you are likely in touch with Jesus, the historical Jesus. And he employs this to make a historical argument for the resurrection. All right? Now, how does he do that? Well, resurrection is credible within Judaism, right? Maybe not if you're a Sadducee, but if you were a Pharisee or, they believed in resurrection. You then have to account for how this dispirited band of disciples become a world-changing force. And particularly, how you get the relatively quick subsequent development of a diverse community, Jews and Gentiles, worshiping Christ in a monotheistic Christianity. Right? So within a few decades of Christ's death, you have Jews and Gentiles coming together, worshiping Jesus as divine, as Lord, within a monotheistic Christianity. How does that happen? And his answer is, the only answer that makes sense is that the resurrection happened. That's the only explanation.
I heard a quote one time, maybe I'm paraphrasing it or something like this. It's like, if you were to tell me that the Jew was to change the world, I wouldn't believe it. But here we are, calling our children Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and naming our dogs Caesar and Rome.
Yeah. So the idea is that, when you throw a rock into the lake and you get the ripples, Wright says you can look at the ripples and trace your way back and figure out where the rock went in. Right? And by the size and shape of the ripples, you can know how big the rock was, and that's what the resurrection is. You can see the ripples, and the only way to explain these ripples is if resurrection actually happened. Right? Now again, he gets a lot of pushback on that, saying, you can't make historical arguments for unique events. Right? Yeah. Because history is the study of the general working out of things, right? But he argues that you can actually make an argument for the historicity of the resurrection. Now, not surprisingly, his Jesus looks an awful lot like the Synoptic Jesus. Because his starting point is you come up with a hypothesis and then you see if you can verify it. Right? So if you start with the Synoptic Jesus, you're able to account for the most information. There have been pushbacks, though, even from more conservative scholars, arguing that this is still a different Jesus. Right? Just to make one point, there's very little Johannine influence in Wright's Jesus. Which makes this essentially, again, a fifth gospel. It's the equivalent of a fifth, because it's a different Jesus than we see in either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Does that make sense? It's the diatessaron problem again. You smash it all together to come up with a unified picture. But that's different than the picture you get when you look at the four of them together. And so, even though this looks a lot more, and we're a lot happier with it, generally, it's still different than what the canonical Gospels testify to. Does that make sense?
And I hesitate only because we read one of his books in systematic theology, and I know that I had a hard time with the book at first, but the more I learned about what he was saying in other texts about Jesus, what he was saying about first century practices, lifestyle, and how that would have impacted Jesus, I just thought that he was answering that first question, how does Jesus fit into Judaism? And it just seemed like he had a connection with Jesus' Judaism in his writings, in the way that I had not. It challenged my understanding of some things that I had accepted for most of the time.
Mainly challenged our class about his concept of rapture.
Yes, yes.
That really made us talk from.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Wright asks really good questions. I'm not sure his answers are always the best. But he asks really good questions. And he's also gotten pushback. One of his big tenets is that Israel still saw themselves being in exile. And that exile was still the defining, framework and he's gotten a lot of pushback on that. Because he like if you read through his first volume in the People of God, he talks about worldviews and some people argue he makes too much of that in terms of reconstructing the worldview and then imposing that on text. Again, though, his Jesus looks the most like the canonical Jesus of anyone that we've talked about, which is in part by design, because he's trying to come up with a Jesus that can explain, the data. Again, people like Jesus seminar scholars would say, well, why do we want to explain that data? You got to determine what's authentic first, and then you try to come up with a picture that fits that. One of the things where I think Wright is right is that this idea that we have to account for why are the Gospels what they are. Right? Can we explain? If Jesus was the Jesus seminar Jesus, why in the world did someone write Matthew? Which doesn't look like the Jesus seminar Jesus. Or Mark, or Luke, or John. Right? You've got to be able to explain how we end up with these four Gospels. And if your Jesus can't explain how you end up with those four Gospels, then you haven't done a very good job of getting in touch with the historical Jesus. Does that make sense? Because not only did they choose to write and portray Jesus in these four ways, but the church affirmed that this was in touch with who Jesus really was. Right? The state of the question today. There is a growing awareness that the criteria are problematic. And you can kind of, even if you have a rigid method, you can still manipulate it by how you put sources and what strata and all of that. The criteria can also conflict with one another, right? So multiple attestation is kind of at odds with dissimilarity, right? Dissimilarity is looking for things that are unique. Multiple attestation is looking for things that everybody's talking about. I think that could be a bit overplayed. I mean, it's how you apply it. In some cases, dissimilarity is appropriate. In other cases, multiple attestation is appropriate. But the criteria haven't led to greater consensus. Right? Even when everybody agrees on the criteria, they still come up with vastly different Jesuses, which suggests they're not as objective as we might like to think. And that's the big problem. They're too easily manipulated. You can kind of use the criteria to justify whatever you want. And then there's a growing awareness that there's not necessarily a clear distinction between authentic and inauthentic. Right? What do they mean here? Well, say that Matthew has composed the Sermon on the Mount. There was no time where Jesus went up on a mountain and said all those words in that order. But if that is true to what Jesus did teach, is it really inauthentic? Does that make sense? So the line there is getting blurred a lot. What does it mean for something to be inauthentic? Right? And what kind of criteria are we using to establish that? Mm-hmm.
Can you change that to say, or remove the say that you said, not necessarily a clear distinction between historical Jesus and real Jesus?
I'd have to think about that a bit more. My hesitation is the real Jesus, we're never going to be able to get completely in touch with all of Jesus was through historical means. Well, right, and that's kind of the point here. And the point here is it's not even clear what we're looking for, right? Because we know they didn't have a tape recorder. So if you can prove that Jesus said but instead of and, does that make the whole saying inauthentic? Well, one, how would you ever prove that? But two, why would that make it inauthentic if it's still, capturing the gist of what Jesus said? And there's also a growing recognition that memories are faulty. So you'll see a lot of people try to ground, the historicity of the Gospels in the fact that the eyewitnesses wrote them, or people who talk to eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses can be wrong. And in fact, every time we call up a memory, we're changing it and shaping it a bit to fit the circumstances that caused us to call it up. Right? We shape our memory. Memories are not, locked in. They're malleable. They can change. Witnesses lie. Right?
No.
But the argument here is even if all the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are reliable in the sense of, everything is exactly the way they said it happened. So given all that, how do we go forward? Well, that should be one instead of two. Sources have to be regarded as historical artifacts that must be explained, not just things to be mined for data. Okay, again, you have to be able to explain why someone chose to depict Jesus as Matthew does. Right? If Jesus was like the Jesus Seminar Jesus, why would someone have written Matthew? Does that distinction make sense? You've got to be able to explain how we end up with the things that we have instead of just using them to mine them for data points that you can use to reconstruct a picture over here. Does that make sense? So you've got to be able to explain them. And then memory. Memory studies and looking at how both cognitively what goes on when we remember, but also how communities remember and how societies remember. Cultural memory, how those things operate. And there's also a growing emphasis on testimony. And again, recognizing that at some point you have to accept testimony. If you're interested in this, A Biblical History of Israel by Ian Provan and Philip Long has a very good discussion looking particularly at Old Testament issues of historicity, but about the importance of testimony and how you can't dismiss the biblical text just because they're texts. A Biblical History of Israel. Right, and again, it's the same idea with trying to explain, well, how did we get Mark, or how did we get Matthew if Jesus was just this wandering cynic philosopher? Right, I mean, what would have led someone to portray him in this way, if that's who he really was? And so again, you've got to be able to explain how we end up with the pictures of Jesus that we have. And then again, just a final exhortation. Resist the urge to smash them all together.
You got to take them as each individual.
Let each have their voice. Because that's the only way to get in touch with the real Jesus. Right?
And that's where we have to preach the good and the bad in the Scriptures and let our congregation make a decision, or we all come together to make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
We just can't cherry pick all the goodness of Jesus. I mean, there is the Jesus did bleed and get whipped. So there is pain in being a Christian.
Yeah.
Not just all.
And there is mercy, but there is also judgment.
Yeah.
And if you forget one in favor of the other, you're just like the children screaming
You're
back.
going to be walking in the wilderness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that harkens back to, I had the thought about where we would create for ourselves the story. Why would God choose for the story of the Israelites being slaves and beaten by everybody and enslaved? Why would they be the chosen people of God? Wouldn't they be more elevated than subjugated?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm. All right. Any questions about historical Jesus? The other thing Wright emphasizes, I think rightly, is don't surrender the historical Jesus. Because if you surrender the historical Jesus, then you end up with where we were after Schweitzer. So it may be difficult, and again, one of the problems with criteria is you may be able to say he was baptized by John and likely talked about the 12, but most things you're not going to be able to decide one way or the other. In most cases, criteria don't really help you. And so, I mean, like Sanders comes with a list of 8 things that we can say about Jesus. Well, that's great, but what about all the other things that it says he did? But that doesn't mean that we should surrender the historical Jesus, right? Because we do need to keep our understanding grounded in that historicity. God thought history important enough to enter into it. And if he took history that seriously, we probably should too.
hence he created chaos.
Yes.
By doing so.
Yes. All right. You have obviously got the key theme of the course. Seek the chaos. All right. Well, have a good week.